Gormagat Cahirlock agus Hianadori, and I move now that this bill be read a second time. Cahirlock, I'm pleased to have the opportunity to introduce the second stage of the Planning and Development Amendment Large-Scale Residential Development Bill 2021 to the Seanad, and I do wish to thank you and the members for facilitating an early debate on this very important bill. As you'll be aware, the Programme for Government Our Shared Future committed to not extending the strategic housing development planning arrangements which were introduced under the previous government's Rebuilding Ireland Action Plan, and we committed not to extend them beyond their legislative expiry date of the 25th of February 2022. Furthermore, Action 12.3 of Government's more recent Housing for All Action Plan, which we did have statements here in the Seanad on Cahirlock, commits to the introduction of a new planning process for large-scale residential developments to replace the SHD arrangements. I'm happy that this bill delivers both on the commitments in the Programme for Government and in Housing for All. In essence, the provisions contained in the bill will restore the two-stage planning process for large-scale housing developments, with decision-making for such development proposals rightly returning to the local planning authorities in the first instance, with the possibility of a subsequent appeal to Umbor Planola. In addition to the benefits of returning the primary decision-making functions for large-scale residential developments to the local level, the reintroduction of an appeal mechanism to the board should assist in reducing the number of judicial review challenges against LRD planning application decisions, contrary to the SHD arrangements, where the only appeal mechanism in that process was actually a judicial review to the High Court. Moving to the contents of the bill itself and the structure of the bill, it contains 17 sections, which I will now turn to in more detail. The primary provisions are contained in a limited number of sections, namely 3, 7 and 16, with the supporting provisions for these arrangements contained in the other sections. Rather than go through each section individually, I'll outline, if it's okay, the key elements on the provisions of the bill. The proposed new arrangements will retain some of the positive elements of the SHD arrangements, like the mandatory pre-application consultation of proposed developments between the developer and the planning authority, which can help to tease out issues prior to the submission of the planning application itself, as well as a mandatory decision timelines, thereby providing greater certainty for developers in terms of planning timelines. I believe that is really important as we ramp up our housing delivery and planning for the 33,000 homes that we need per annum over the course of Housing for All. The new arrangements will comprise of 3 stages: pre-application consultation stage, a planning application stage, and, if required, an appeal stage. Turning first to the pre-application, which is primarily detailed in Section 3 of the bill, this will involve 2 steps. Firstly, an initial, more informal pre-application consultation on the proposals between the developer and the planning authority, as is already mandated under Section 247 of the Planning Acts for projects of this scale. This will then be followed up by a formal request for a large residential development meeting by the developer, requiring the submission of fairly detailed initial documentation in relation to the proposed development. Planning authorities will be required to hold such LRD meetings within 4 weeks of receiving the meeting request, and then to issue an LRD opinion within 4 weeks of that LRD meeting. And they are strict timeframes that are made provision for in this bill and will take effect in law once this bill passes. In effect, the formal pre-application consultation stage will take a maximum of 8 weeks in total. The LRD opinion issued by the planning authority will set out whether the documentation submitted by the developer constitutes a reasonable basis for moving to the next stage of the process and submitting a planning application. That will identify any issues that need to be addressed when subsequently submitting a planning application. Drawing from the SHD arrangements, the new pre-application consultation requirement is actually intended to improve the quality of planning applications that are received and subsequently submitted in respect of large-scale housing developments, and reduce the need for further information requests in respect of subsequently submitted planning applications. Moving to the second stage of the LRD process, the planning application stage, the new LRD arrangements will rely on existing Section 34 planning application process and will require planning authorities to determine LRD planning applications within 8 weeks of the receipt of the application, which is indicated with limited scope, and it will be limited scope for additional information requests, the details of which will be set out in supplementary regulations once the bill is passed. Further information requests have in the past, as we'll all know, resulted in considerable delays in determining planning applications. However, under these new arrangements, they are intended to front-load the consideration of a range of issues at the pre-application consultation stage, thereby reducing the need for further information at planning application stage and helping to streamline the decision-making process. With regard to the third stage, the appeal stage, which is provided for in Section 7 of the bill, the Board will be required to determine LRD appeals within a mandatory 16 weeks of receipt of the appeal, again with very limited scope for further information requests. The mandatory timelines for the 3 stages of the LRD planning process, which have the potential to be almost as time efficient as the SHD arrangements they're replacing, but most importantly bringing back the decision making to local government and to local authorities, with those who I believe will have a better understanding of those applications. Thereby it will provide greater clarity and certainty in relation to timelines. To help ensure adherence to mandatory timelines, a penalty payable to the developer will apply to both the planning authority, 3.5 times the application fee paid, or €10,000, whichever is lesser, and the Board, again €10,000 for late decisions on the LRD applications or LRD appeals. I should also mention one important difference from the outgoing SHD arrangements, which is that the new LRD arrangements will allow up to 30% of the gross floor space of the proposed development to be commercial or other use instead of the 15% cap that currently exists. The change acknowledges that such developments, particularly in inner-city brownfield sites, and I've had experience of these myself, tend to require a greater mix of residential and commercial and other use in order to take account of differing needs of inner-city areas, as well as to make LRDs in such inner urban areas more economically viable for developers and better designed and a better mix. In line with the principle of compact growth, more residential development is required in inner urban areas, and this change in the scope of the arrangements is intended to facilitate greater development of brownfield sites in inner urban areas than might otherwise be the case. And obviously, as a government, we'll also be supporting that with the Croí Cónaithe Cities Fund, the Viability Fund, to develop out our brownfield sites in our cities. The bill also proposes a number of transitional arrangements in relation to the expiry of the SHDs and their replacement by these new arrangements. There are 2 scenarios addressed under the transitional arrangements. Firstly, developers with projects already in the SHD system and who have received an opinion on their proposals from the Board on the commencement of the Act will have 16 weeks from that commencement date to submit an SHD application to the Board. Secondly, developers who have commenced the SHD process by requesting pre-application consultations with the Board and are awaiting an opinion on their proposals on the commencement of this Act will have again 16 weeks to submit an application to the Board from the date of the receipt of the pre-application consultation opinion. In both of these scenarios, the Board may then take a further 16 weeks to determine the actual application itself. These are fairly standard transitional arrangements, and they'll generally apply when changing over from one system to another, and this is a significant change. However, it is important to note that for large-scale housing development proposals which have not commenced the SHD process on the date of the commencement of this Act, which we intend to be the 17th of December this year, any such future development proposals for large-scale housing developments will be required to go through this new process. Consequently, it is intended that this 17th of December date will effectively mark the transition from SHD arrangements to the new large-scale residential development arrangements. In conclusion, Cahirley, I think you'll agree that this bill contains a number of fundamental and very important legislative changes. It restores the two-stage planning process for large-scale residential developments, with primary decision-making being returned to local planning authorities in the first instance, and rightly so, and thereby enhancing local democracy. Enhanced public participation in the local decision-making process, with members of the public having two opportunities to input into the process at planning stage and at appeal stage. And we are retaining some of the positive elements of the SHD arrangements, such as the mandatory pre-application consultation and strict decision-making timelines, all of which are aimed at facilitating speedier decision-making in the planning system for much-needed housing supply. And a very final point, clearly, I would like to mention is that these proposed new LRD arrangements will have some resourcing implications for local authorities, particularly those in larger urban areas, but not exclusively. And both I and my department are willing to engage further with the local government sector, and we have been doing so in this regard, with a view to ensuring that the objectives of these new arrangements can be effectively achieved. I genuinely look forward to hearing and listening to the contributions of senators this evening, and accordingly, I commend the bill to the House.